Tyler, are you ready? All right, Brother Teddy, whenever you start, I'll start the clock.
Please take your Bibles to 1 Samuel 9. Today, I just want to bring before you a little Cinderella story. Now, that's a phrase that not everybody here may know. If you're familiar with sports, it's a pretty common one they use. There's going to be a lot of Cinderella stories probably happening this month, actually, as we have the playoffs going on. But a Cinderella story is when a team or a player does something that they weren't supposed to. The odds were against them. They were, too small at that position. They were too weak. They weren't fast enough. They were, whatever. The team wasn't, a good enough team, and they did something incredible. They do something they're not supposed to. They achieve something they're not supposed to. They reach a height they're not supposed to. Maybe they go a little further in the playoffs. Maybe they even just make the league. And that's usually referred to in sports, but it can be used in other situations. And today I want to bring before you somebody that I doubt anybody in this room really admires very much. I want to bring before you King Saul of the Bible. Because Saul, whether we really think of him like that or not, was a Cinderella story. Here in 1 Samuel 9, and actually I'm going to open it over prayer. Dear Father, I just pray for the message. I pray that it would speak to some hearts, and no matter who wins this, Lord, I just pray that people would be able to get something out of it, and thank you for this opportunity. In Jesus' name, amen. In 1 Samuel 9, I'm just going to give us a brief kind of picture of Saul, who he was at the beginning, before his reign, before all the terrible things that we kind of characterize him as. Right, in 1 Samuel 9 here, I'm just going to read a few verses. First we have in verse 2, and he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man, and a goodly, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward he was higher than any of the people. So Saul's a nice young man, right? But we see here in a little bit, verse 21, and Saul answered and said, Am not I a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Wherefore then speakest thou so to me? So at this point, Saul, while he is tall, while he is this, hulking, incredible figure, he's not really the most, he's not the kind of guy you'd pick to be king, because he's in the smallest family and the smallest tribe. You'd want somebody from Judah. You'd want somebody in a position with a good family. We could look at it this way. Saul was a bus kid. Saul was not really in a great situation. He was the least in a small family of the worst tribe, really. The Benjamites did a lot of terrible stuff, so nobody was a huge fan of the Benjamites in the first place. And Saul says, who you are? As Samuel comes to him and tells him, you know what, Israel's hope is on you. Saul says, why? No, it's not. I'm in the smallest family. I'm not at all in a position to do this. And so Saul here, we see Saul was really a Cinderella story. He wasn't the kind of guy you pick to be king. You'd want somebody out of Judah. You want somebody who really had the family line, they had the heritage, they were in the right spot already. And as we know the story goes, Saul becomes king, and I want to take a quick glance at chapter 11, because I think we always look at Saul, and he is this terrible guy who, he's chasing David around, he's killing priests, he's doing all this terrible stuff. He wasn't always like that. When he became king, he was so humble, as we see here, and he knew who he was, and he knew where he was coming from. I'm not going to read anything, but in chapter 11, some people get into some trouble, and they're going to get their eyes gouged out. And Saul, is furious, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he runs over there, and he says, all right, get everybody in Israel, this is not going to go down. So he goes over there, he wipes these people out, and he saves the day. And so Saul doesn't start out terrible. He's actually got a really good, chapter 11 is a great chapter. It's a great story about this Saul guy. But we have a little bit of space here, and in chapter 13, not a good number, is where it all starts to go wrong. It says in verse 1 of chapter 13, it's 1 Samuel, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chosen 3,000 men of Israel, whereof 2,000 were with Saul and Michmash, and he continues on there. And I think all of us, this is the chapter we would think of when we think of Saul. This is one of the stories where, Saul rushes in verse 8, and he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed, but Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. And Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offering. So we're just going to take a little glance here today at sin that will sour Cinderella. Sin that will sour Cinderella. And I think we all know that Saul's greatest sin was his pride. So, firstly, how does this go down? How does this begin? Well, firstly, you become impatient in God's plans. Now, this was not a good situation. We need to give Saul a little bit of a break here. Look at what's going on. When the men of Israel saw it, in verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and thickets and in rocks. This was not a good situation. The Philistines were coming down to wipe them out.
it says in verse 5, and the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. So they're bringing this force down, and Israel's like, we're not gonna make this. We got to get out of here. And so Saul waits 7 days. He waits for the time. He says, you know what? I'm going to trust God. But often we will trust God on our terms, but when it comes down to God's timing, that's when it all goes awry. And that's the first point. Impatient in God's plans. That's what Saul became. He became impatient. And so Saul said in his mind, you know what? God, I know you got this timing. I know you think you know what's right, but I think your timing could be a little better. And I think now is the time that I should do this. So Saul goes ahead and does something that really ruins any chance of his son being king. So secondly, we see here, he becomes inconsiderate of others' needs, and that's in 1 Samuel 14. I'm just going to read the verse, so you don't need to turn there. It says in verse 24, and the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had adjured the people, saying, Cursed be the man that eateth any food until evening, that I may be avenged of mine enemies. So Saul hears in this battle, and obviously, he doesn't want people to eat. He wants people to do it his way. He wants to be this great leader. He wants them to fight his enemies. And he becomes inconsiderate of others' needs. Ultimately, the Christian life is not about you.
Yeah.
It's about others. And when you start making it about, I'm going to do this great ministry work, and I'm going to help these people, and you push people down to get up to other people, you're not doing it right. You're never going to be hurting others. You're never going to be harming anybody to help anybody. If you're doing it the right way, that's never going to happen. So he becomes inconsiderate. And in point 3, we have he gets an incomplete trust in God. And that's 1 Samuel 15. Just kind of going through here through his life. But Saul and the people spared, this is verse 9. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen. And we all kind of know this story. I'm kind of rushing here. Because, we see Saul says, this is kind of first full circle of point 1. Saul goes from becoming impatient in God's timing to just flat out saying, God, I know better. I know what you want. You want a sacrifice. You know what? These are some good sheep here. These are some good oxen. This is some good cattle. These are some good people. We've got the king here. You don't want me to take them out. I know better. I think you'd appreciate this more. So Saul goes from being just impatient to now he's inconsiderate of others, and then he gets an incomplete trust in God. He says to God, you know what? I don't think you know what you want. I think I do. And he starts to think he understands better than God. And then we see point 4 here. He gets incorrect priorities. And with Goliath, we see that. And we see this multiple times, even in chapter 14. Saul is sitting around when it's not personal to him, but when it's his enemies, when he wants to be avenged of his enemies, then that's when he wants to get moving. And I think that's very picturesque of our lives. I think often in my life, I've gotten focused on trying to eradicate sin out of my life. And I want to be this perfect Christian, and I want to do all these things. We have to remember, why are we doing this? What are we doing here? It's not, we shouldn't get a personal view on, this is my duty, and obviously it is to a degree, but at the end of the day, it's God who you're obeying, not what's right, what you feel like. Because look, if all we were supposed to do was do what we felt like, what we thought was right, why don't we go and just, do all these great things? There's so many great organizations. You've got people that will start orphanages in Africa and all this stuff, and that's great, but ultimately we're here to bring people to Christ. Fifthly, he became intimidated by fellow believers. And this that's pride just going down the stretch. He begins to get competitive with people. And why was he? Because he knew that he was going against God's plan. Why would he be scared of David? Because David stood for what he knew he was going against, which is God. Point 6, he had an immature view of himself. Later on, we see Saul kind of whimpering these people, help me find David, he's so sneaky, he's getting away. In chapter 23 of 1 Samuel, Saul is beginning to act like a child because you know what? He's trying to victimize himself. He's the one that's trying to murder this innocent man. David never did anything to Saul. All he did was obey him. And that leads us to finally point 7, which is he becomes insane. And he goes nuts. And obviously, chapter 31, the only chapter that God's not mentioned, Saul dies. That's the last chapter that Saul's in that he's really involved in. And that's the only chapter that God's name is not mentioned once that Saul's involved in. And that's when God says, you know what? You want to abandon me. You don't want to abandon my commandments. I'm going to have to abandon you, Saul, because I'm just going to bring you home. And that's really what happened, as we know. Saul was a saved man. He had so much potential, as he was preaching about today, and yet he wasted it with pride. And in conclusion, what is the difference between Saul and David? Because David did a lot of bad stuff too. I mean, he killed a man, he committed adultery. What's the difference? David was humble, and we see that in Psalms 51. We see David's outlook on his life and himself. So in conclusion, what's the key to getting out of the sin that was our Cinderella? That would be humility and asking God. Remembering who you are, because ultimately, if you're a Cinderella, you're always going to be Cinderella, whether you think you're supposed to be there or not.
Amen.